Hey everyone, and welcome to This Explainer. Today, we are diving into a massive historical puzzle. We're traveling back to 1898 to look at the Spanish-American War. You know, history is full of crazy conflicts, but this one stands out for a very specific reason. Spain willingly declared war on a nation that was virtually guaranteed to absolutely crush them. So, the absolutely crucial question we're going to explore today is this: why fight a war you are almost guaranteed to lose? The United States demanded Spain abandon Cuba. Spain could have just said, okay, walked away and saved an immense amount of blood and treasure. But they didn't. They chose to fight. Why? Think about the stark contrast between these two nations at the time. The United States was booming. We're talking a modern economy with massive resources, a rapidly growing population, totally united. Spain, on the other hand, they were a frail shadow of their former imperial glory. They were already bleeding resources, just trying to suppress violent revolts in Cuba and the Philippines. Madrid's heavy-handed response was taking a massive, terrible toll. To piece together this puzzle, we're going to tackle 6 key areas. First, a one-sided conflict. Second, the path to war. Third, pride and political paranoia. Fourth, the military delusion. Fifth, the European rescue fantasy. And finally, a devastating reality check. Let's get right into it.
Okay, part 1, a one-sided conflict. USA versus Spain.
By literally every single metric that matters, population, industrial capacity, resource access, the United States was vastly more powerful than Spain. And the eventual war, it reflected this completely. It was incredibly short, and Spain's defeat was absolute. Keeping this immense, glaring power disparity in mind makes Spain's choice to engage all the more intriguing. So how on earth did they get to the point of drawing swords? Section 2, the path to war, the escalation in 1898. Let's trace how things escalated so fast. Back in 1897, the U.S. public was outraged by sensationalized press reports of Spanish cruelty in Cuba. Tensions spiked with a Havana riot, some diplomatic insults, and then the spark. The USS Maine explodes. Now, President McKinley initially opposed war. He actually pushed hard for a ceasefire, and both sides wanted one. But there was this tragic, fatal miscommunication. Spain thought ceasefire meant the Cuban rebels would surrender. The Americans thought it meant Cuba would get independence. When the U.S. learned Spain wasn't planning on leaving, well, peace talks just totally collapsed. With war seeming totally unavoidable, the United States took a decisive step. They implemented a naval blockade of Spanish Cuba. Now, universally, blockading another nation's waters is recognized as a direct act of war. It's essentially drawing a line in the sand. Once the Americans put those ships in place, Spain's hand was completely forced, and they officially retaliated by declaring war. Moving on to Section 3, pride and political paranoia. Spain's domestic trap. Here's where it gets really interesting. Politicians in Madrid were actually perfectly willing to grant Cuba autonomy, but completely abandoning Cuba, that was impossible. It was a classic, inescapable political trap. Giving up Cuba meant absolute political suicide. But it was worse than just losing an election. The government was facing an imminent military revolt and a full-scale revolution right at home in Madrid. It was basically a terrifying domino effect for Spanish politicians. Think about how this cascades. Step 1, you abandon Cuba. Step 2, the military views this as an intolerable affront to their national honor, and they implicitly threaten to turn their swords on their own government. Step 3, the public feels this deep national mortification because Cuba was viewed as the birthplace of their entire empire, which leads directly to Step 4, turmoil and total revolution in Spain itself. So they literally declared war abroad to prevent a war at home. Section 4, the military delusion, a false sense of confidence. Now, when you look at the raw numbers, there's some fascinating nuance. On paper, the armies looked very, very different. The U.S. Army only had about 30,000 men, while Spain boasted roughly 250,000. But that massive numerical advantage? Total illusion. Most Spanish troops were bogged down fighting colonial rebellions and were completely ravaged by disease. The rest were stuck thousands of miles away in Spain. And while the navies were similar in size, the U.S. fleet was modern, packed with much better tech, and highly concentrated. Spain's older navy was divided all across the globe, making it incredibly vulnerable.
Despite that glaring technological gap, there was this fatal overconfidence. It's summed up perfectly by a belief that was widely held in Europe at the time. The Americans didn't have a long-standing naval tradition. Many genuinely believe the U.S. lacked the experience for major fleet actions, putting them at a severe disadvantage against the historic, storied Spanish Navy. Well, as history quickly showed, that delusional optimism wouldn't last 5 minutes once the cannons actually started firing.
All right, Section 5. The European Rescue Fantasy. Waiting for backup. Spain had pursued an isolationist, non-interventionist foreign policy for decades. Because of this, they figured none of the European great powers would have any reason to want to see Spain diminished. They genuinely believed that other empires simply wouldn't tolerate the United States expanding its territory and power unchecked. So Spain's grand strategy was basically to start the war, endure the initial blows, and then just wait for Britain, France, or Germany to intervene on their behalf to protect their own imperial interests. It was their ultimate fatal gamble. But man, these were incredibly bad bets. Spain's hope for British help was a complete pipe dream. Britain actually viewed Spain as a backward has-been, and they were actively cozying up to Washington, hoping to see another English-speaking power step onto the global stage. France, meanwhile, actually was terrified of an American victory and a new rival naval power, but they were completely paralyzed because their economy relied heavily on importing natural resources from the U.S. So France opted to just sit on the sidelines and hope for the best. So that left Germany. Germany was super worried that a Spanish defeat might weaken monarchism all across Europe. But they too refused to openly declare support for Spain, again, because of deep trade ties with the U.S. Instead, Germany tried to play it opportunistically. They literally shadowed the U.S. fleet in the Pacific, hoping to sneakily grab the Philippines or maybe set up some naval bases while the dust settled. They even tried to convince the U.S. that taking the islands would threaten the European balance of power, but the Americans were absolutely clear. They wanted zero European interference, and they completely ignored Germany. The cavalry was definitely not coming. Finally, Section 6. A devastating reality check. The fall of an empire. With absolutely no one coming to save them, Spain clung to one last-ditch strategy. They hoped that their forces in Cuba, Puerto Rico, and the Philippines would put up such fierce resistance that they would inflict massively high casualties on the Americans. The goal here was to exhaust the U.S. public's appetite for war and force Washington into a negotiated face-saving peace deal. You know, a deal where Spain might at least get to keep the Philippines. But reality had completely other plans. The U.S. simply swelled the size of its army and continued to win a rapid, crushing string of decisive victories. Spain desperately pled for peace. But the U.S., knowing full well they were winning handily, refused to stop until they maximized their gains. The war ended with a complete, undeniable American victory. The resulting treaty was just an unmitigated disaster for the Spanish Empire. They were forced to sign away Cuba, Puerto Rico, the Philippines, and Guam. It was a total geographic and political gutting of their overseas territories. Which leaves us with this final, provocative thought. Spain went to war knowing the odds were terrible. They did it because politicians feared domestic revolution, the military was blinded by a delusional sense of honor, and they harbored this wild fantasy that rival empires would rush to their rescue. The dark irony is, by choosing to fight to preserve their national honor, their international prestige was forever shattered, marking the definitive end of Spain as a world power. So when you look at the total loss of an empire, was appeasing domestic pride really worth the cost? It's a massive warning about the dangers of domestic politics driving foreign policy. And honestly, it still echoes today. Thank you so much for joining me for this explainer. Keep asking questions, and I'll catch you next time.